the biggest and bloodiest battles to that point in history. The titanic clash that brought a generation of terrible warfare to a close. Decisively ended the career of Napoleon Bonaparte and marked the start of a century of relative peace. It was the Battle of Waterloo. For over 20 years, Europe had been at war. The French people had killed their king, fought off invaders who came to reverse their revolution, and gone on the offensive. They attacked their neighbours to spread the fire of republicanism. In that maelstrom of instability and violence, one man had emerged to dominate France, a military genius who routed foreign enemies on the battlefield just as he brushed aside domestic rivals. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1812, he had declared himself emperor, annexed chunks of northern Italy, Spain, the Netherlands and Germany. He'd set up puppet regimes across much of the rest of Europe, and he'd humbled Prussia, Russia and Austria. But his insatiable ambition was his undoing, at either end of the continent. An attempt to occupy Spain and Portugal provoked ferocious resistance and became a quagmire, sucking in men and money, while a gigantic attempt to invade Russia in 1812 ended in catastrophe. His mighty army was annihilated in the winter snows. The emperor was fatally weakened. Two years later, a huge coalition of European powers invaded France itself, forced Napoleon to abdicate and sent him to the small island of Elba off the coast of Italy. The war was over. The great statesmen of Europe gathered to make peace. They met in Vienna, for dancing, dalliances, dining and diplomacy, but they were premature. In the spring of 1815, the exiled Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, escaped his jailers and landed with a small band of followers in southern France. With characteristic dash, charisma and speed, he marched hard to Paris. Troops deserted to his cause, and he entered the capital as the king fled abroad. The powers of Europe trembled that Napoleon was back on the throne. They amassed an overwhelming coalition to strike at France from every angle. Hundreds of thousands of Russians, Spaniards, Portuguese, Austrian, German, Dutch, and British troops. Napoleon decided to make a lightning assault, smash one element of this coalition and deter the rest to sow division among his enemies. The most obvious target was an allied force in what is now Belgium. Until recently part of France, Napoleon gambled this might be friendly territory with its troops unwilling to fight their former emperor. He thought the British troops were second-rate and their commander, the Duke of Wellington, who might have humiliated Napoleon's marshals in the Peninsular War, but would be no match for the emperor himself. In June 1815, Napoleon marched north. He crossed the border on the 15th of June, brilliantly driving a wedge between Wellington's British and Allied army based around Brussels and a Prussian army at Namur. As the Allies scrambled to respond, Napoleon lunged at the Prussians first, driving them back at the Battle of Ligny. Napoleon had his first victory of the campaign. It would be his last. British troops halted a detachment of Napoleon's army at Quatre Bras, but as the Prussians retreated, Wellington gave the order to pull back. Lashed by torrential rain, Wellington's men trudged north. He ordered them to take up position on a defensive ridge he had identified just south of Brussels. Napoleon's French army was over there. It was marching up from the French border. Wellington, the Allied commander, had decided that he needed to stop the French army on this ridge, the Mont Saint-Jean ridge. It was the last place he could stop them before Brussels, which is just that way, and there's a little village just behind this ridge called Waterloo, and that gave its name to this battle. It was a hard night. The men slept in canvas tents that let the water in. Thousands of feet and hooves churned the ground into a sea of mud.
We were up to our knees in mud and stinking water. We had no choice. We had to settle down in the mud and filth as best we could, men and horses shaking with cold.
But on the morning of the 18th, the storms had passed. Napoleon planned an all-out assault on the British and Allied army, rout it before the Prussians could come to its aid, and capture Brussels. The only thing in his way was Wellington's polyglot, untested Allied army. He had around about 67,000 men. Less than half of those men were British. Wellington was commanding an Allied army. The majority of his troops were Dutch Belgians and various German kingdoms and principalities. He was scathing about his army. He said it was an infamous army and it was ill-equipped. It had been cobbled together at the last minute, and it now faced an army with a lot of French veterans marching north under Napoleon, one of the great commanders of all time. Wellington strengthened his position by turning 3 great farm complexes into fortresses. On the right, over there, Hougoumont. That was anchor of his right wing. Then we come over to the centre here. The French troops are marching up this road over here. You can see they're deploying over there. Then we got La Haye-Sainte. That was the anchor of Wellington's central position there. And then further over there, in the distance, you can see amongst the haze over there. That's Papelotte, that he also fortified. Napoleon outnumbered Wellington, and his troops were seasoned veterans. He planned a massive artillery barrage followed by massed infantry and cavalry attacks. His guns were slow to get into position because of the mud, but he brushed off concerns, telling his staff that Wellington was a poor general, and it would be nothing more than eating breakfast. His first assault would be against Wellington's western flank to distract his attention before launching a French attack right at his centre. The target of this diversionary attack would be the farm buildings of Hougoumont. At around 11:30, Napoleon's guns opened up. An eyewitness described them as being like a volcano, 80 cannons sending iron balls hurtling into Allied lines. Then, the French infantry assault began. They marched across these fields, and they took a terrible pounding, the French. They were obliterated by artillery fire. There were sharpshooters in these walls. They made little holes in these walls so they could shoot through them. And the farmhouse itself is a bit like a fortress. So the French troops took a terrible pounding. And it began as a diversionary attack, but really as the day went on, it became an obsession with the French on this side of the battlefield. And they kept feeding men into what was coming this absolutely appalling battle, suffering terrible casualties, using lots of ammunition, when actually Napoleon had only meant it to be a diversion in the first place. Just after 1 o'clock, Napoleon sent his infantry forward at the other side of the battlefield. Massive columns of men trampled the crops as they trudged up the slope toward Wellington's army. Eagles held aloft, bands playing, men singing, men shouting, "Vive l'Empereur, long live the Emperor," and they'd have marched down into the valley below and start trudging up this hill. Exhausting work. The crops were 6 foot high, it was heavily muddy, their boots had been covered in mud, they'd been staggering up this hill by the time they got to where I am. The fighting was at bayonet point. They were fighting eyeball to eyeball. Musketry, the muskets back then only fired about 50 metres, so you had to be right up close to your enemy. And in certain places, actual hand-to-hand fighting. The Allied line was pushed back. Wellington had to act fast, and he deployed his cavalry in one of the most famous charges of British history. The cavalry crashed into the French infantry, 2,000 horsemen, some of the most illustrious units of the British Army, elite lifeguards, as well as dragoons from England, Ireland, and Scotland. The French scattered. A mass of fleeing men surged back towards their own lines. The British cavalry, in high excitement, followed them and ended up among the French cannon. Another counterattack, this time by Napoleon, who sent his legendary lancers and armour-clad cuirassiers to drive off the exhausted Allied men and horses. This hectic seesawing ended with both sides back where they'd begun. The French infantry and Wellington's cavalry both suffered terrible losses. Corpses of men and horses now littered the battlefield. At 4 p.m, Napoleon's deputy, Marshal Ney, known as the bravest of the brave, thought he saw an Allied withdrawal and launched the mighty French cavalry to try and swamp the Allied centre, which he hoped might be wavering. 9,000 men and horses rushed Allied lines. Wellington's infantry immediately formed squares, a hollow square with every man pointing his weapon outwards, allowing for all-round defence. Wave after wave of cavalry charged.
Not a man present who survived could have forgotten in afterlife the awful grandeur of that charge. He discovered at a distance what appeared to be an overwhelming, long-moving line, which, ever advancing, glittered like a stormy wave of the sea when it catches the sunlight. On they came until they got near enough, whilst the very earth seemed to vibrate beneath the thundering tramp of the mounted host. One might suppose that nothing could have resisted the shock of this terrible moving mass.
So you can imagine right here, the cavalry swirling between these squares like wild water in a river going past rocks. And attacking them from all sides, but not managing to break into these squares at all because their bayonets, that the men had bayonets out, sharpened steel bayonets, they had their muskets, and horses will charge, but they're not suicidal, they won't charge in against a wall of steel, spiky bayonets. So the cavalry swirled about, and this went on for some time. The French cavalry took terrible, terrible casualties. The squares became hospitals. In the middle of the squares, the dead and wounded would pile up, and eventually the French cavalry were totally exhausted, turned around and retreated back towards French lines. It was a terrible battering, but the British Allied line just held. By late afternoon, Napoleon's plan had stalled. He now faced a terrible threat. Against the odds, Wellington's army had held firm, and now from the east, the Prussians were arriving. Defeated 2 days before at Ligny, the Prussians still had fight in them, and now they were threatening to trap Napoleon. The Emperor redeployed men to slow them down and redoubled his efforts to smash through Wellington's lines. The farm of La Haye-Sainte was captured by the French, They pushed artillery and sharpshooters into it and blasted the Allied centre at close range. Under terrible pressure, Wellington muttered, "Night, or the Prussians must come." The Prussians were coming. More and more troops fell upon Napoleon's right flank. The Emperor was under assault almost from 3 sides. In desperation, he played his final card. He ordered his last reserve, his finest troops, to advance. The Imperial Guard, veterans of dozens of his battles, marched up the slope. Dutch artillery pounded the guardsmen, and a Dutch bayonet charge put one battalion to flight. Others, though, continued to trudge towards the crest of the ridge. When they arrived, they found it strangely quiet. 1,500 British foot guards were lying down, waiting for the command to jump up and fire. And Wellington shouted, "Now, Maitland, now's your time." Maitland was in charge of the guards that were down here. They stood up and they started firing characteristic British volleys into the mass of the French infantry that were attacking. The British used to fight in the thin red line, long, thin line, so that every single British soldier could use their musket. So it didn't look as impressive, it looked thin and wispy, but every British soldier could use their musket, bring their gun to bear. The French advanced in a far bigger pack, which looks and sounded very impressive, was great for morale, but meant the people in the rear ranks couldn't use their muskets. And so the British firepower poured into the French, and then something extraordinary happened. For the first time in decades of war, Napoleon's elite force, the Imperial Guard, turned and fled. When the French army saw the Guard recoil, a shout went up, and the entire army disintegrated. Napoleon's mighty force was instantly transformed into a panicking rabble of fleeing men. It was over. As the sun set on the 18th of June 1815, bodies of men and horses littered the battlefield. Something like 50,000 men had been killed or wounded. One eyewitness visited a few days later.
The sight was too horrible to behold. I felt sick in the stomach and was obliged to return. The multitude of carcasses, the heaps of wounded men with mangled limbs, unable to move, and perishing from not having had their wounds dressed or from hunger, as the Anglo-Allies were, of course, obliged to take their surgeons and wagons with them. It formed a spectacle I shall never forget. The wounded, both of the Anglo-Allies and the French, remain in an equally deplorable state.
It was a bloody victory, but a decisive one. Napoleon had no choice but to abdicate from the imperial throne of France a week later. Trapped by the Royal Navy, he surrendered to the captain of HMS Bellerophon and was taken into captivity. It was the end of a great war, bloodier and more costly in relative terms, even than the First World War. It was also the end of the career of Napoleon, one of history's most talented statesmen and commanders. But it was also a beginning, the start of a period of relative peace, an era also of extraordinary imperial expansion outside Europe and remarkable economic and technological advances within it.